First lesson today is Psalm 78, 1 through 7. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord, and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a decree in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and rise up and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments.
Darkness
Second lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour."
Join me in prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Like most young teenagers, I was thrilled when my parents gave me permission to stay at home alone. No more long, boring shopping trips that didn't involve me. No more uncomfortable nights up at my grandparents' house being watched over by these two. I was growing up. I could stay home alone. I'd have the whole house to myself. And permission was given during the summer, so it was light into the evening hours. That wasn't so bad. But then when winter came and it got dark around 5, it was a whole different story. Who knew what was outside the house in that rural neighborhood? And what about those strange noises that the house seemed to make? Now, sure, my grandparents lived just up the road, but that was over 100 yards away across a dark field. And they weren't so young anymore. It took them a while to answer the phone. And 2 elderly people weren't going to be able to do much against that unknown evil lurking outside. So I began to get anxious about my parents' return. No cell phones in those days. No way to hear from them unless they stopped at a payphone and for some reason would choose to call the house. So I began to do some simple math in my head. They left about 6:30 p.m. Take them about 20 minutes to drive to the store where they were going. Maybe another 60 to 90 minutes to shop, less if my father could keep my mother to go. And then maybe stopping at another store on the way back home. Yeah, they should pull into the driveway just about 9 p.m. 9 p.m. came and went. Every minute past 9 seemed like an hour. What if the car broke down? What if they got into an accident? All sorts of wild thoughts go through a young teenager's mind. The waiting was killing me. It wasn't fun to stay home alone anymore. But then the car pulled into the driveway. My parents came in the back door. I put on my best adult face and said, "Back already?" Jesus' parable about the wise and foolish bridesmaids is, at first reading, about waiting, about being prepared. about being alert. Weddings were unique in Jesus' day in that Jewish culture. Most marriages were arranged by families, and so the bride and bridegroom only would meet a couple times before the day of their marriage. And in the wedding traditions of the time, the bridegroom would come to the bride's house to take possession of his bride and walk her to the wedding feast. And this usually took place in the late afternoon or early evening. Bridesmaids would gather at the bride's house, and they would bring lamps so that they could light the way in a grand procession for the bride and the bridegroom. And it was a task of great honor to be a light bearer in the procession. In the parable, Jesus tells us the 10 bridesmaids who waited at the bride's house for the bridegroom. 5 had lamps full of oil, more than enough oil for an early evening walk to the wedding. 5 also had their lamps full of oil, but they had brought with them a reserve supply. And as Jesus tells it, the bridegroom was late. He was delayed. He was very late. And they all fell asleep. At midnight, the cry came out, "The bridegroom is coming." All 10 were running out of oil in their lamps by that time, but 5 had reserve. The 5 whose lamps were going out ran off into the darkened town to try to buy more oil, and the procession went on without them, just 5 bridesmaids in this procession. And at the doors of the wedding feast, they were shut and barred as soon as all had entered. And when the 5 who had run out of oil came and pounded on the doors, they were told they were not welcome. The wise and the foolish, Jesus says. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. The Gospel of Matthew uses this parable of Jesus to speak a word to those early Christians who were anxious for Jesus' return and for the coming of his kingdom. Those early followers believed that Jesus would come back and establish his earthly kingdom within the lifetime of those original disciples. But now, these disciples were dead. The gospel was written around 80 to 90 AD, about 50 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And they lived in tough times. They lived in hard times. There was persecution. There was discrimination. They were impatient, and they were losing hope. Jesus' parable was included in Matthew to speak to this impatience, this fading hope, this need to wait and be prepared. And yet there's more to this parable than just preparing and waiting and watching. To some readers, this parable has some hard messages which are not consistent with Jesus' teachings found in other places in the Gospels. And when you look at it, the 5 foolish bridesmaids who didn't bring enough oil seem to be treated unjustly, unfairly. And by the way, the Greek word we translate as foolish really means moronic, slow, and stupid. It's not very complimentary to these 5 bridesmaids. It was a harsh condemnation and doesn't always reflect the compassion and kindness we usually see in Jesus. But the foolish bridesmaids prepared just as they had prepared for other weddings. They brought lamps trimmed and full of oil. They had faithfully done what was expected of them. No one expected them to bring extra oil. It wasn't their fault that the bridegroom was late. A bridegroom showing up at midnight was unheard of. Some criticized the 5 for falling asleep, but remember, all 10 fell asleep, as probably we would have a similar situation. Note also that the 5 who had the extra oil showed no generosity, compassion, or sympathy. They would not share what they had brought along with them. And probably with a slightly superior tone, they said, well, yeah, you can go out and buy some from the dealers, right, at midnight. And then when the 5 foolish knocked at the banquet door, the bridegroom took no responsibility for being late. He just told them to go away. No understanding, no tolerance, no compassion. So when we dig down deep into this parable, there are a lot of hard points, a lot of rough edges, a lot of challenges. Today, almost 2,100 years later, we're still waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. The expectations of the early Christians for Christ's return are not as sharp as they were for them as they are for us. And so we sort of muddle on, don't we? And we look around at a world which sometimes seems like it's on the verge of madness. War, terrorism, nuclear saber rattling, poverty, homelessness, disease. And then we bow our heads and shed tears at tragic and senseless murders, families at worship, people walking along a bike trail in New York City, people at a country music concert in Las Vegas, young people dancing in a nightclub in Orlando, children in their classrooms at school. It's hard. It's very hard to have confidence and hope. When we look at the parable of the wise and foolish, I think the only thing that made the foolish foolish was that they left the wedding procession. They ran from their responsibilities and went to desperately look for more oil. They could have stayed with the others. They could have joined the procession, even though they did not have lamps that would light. And they were shut out of the wedding banquet, not because they didn't have enough oil. They were excluded because they had abandoned their sisters, their friend the bride, and the bridegroom. And so, the lesson I take away from the parable is this today. In hard times like this, these hard times in which we live, we need to stay together. We need to do what we've been called to do. We need to be there for each other, our neighbors here and throughout the world. And we always need to be faithful to the mission of Jesus Christ as we wait and as we watch and as we serve. Amen.